Hello and welcome to Finextra. I'm Ben Poole. Today we're at the Diebold Nixdorf International Management Seminar and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Broadbent, who's VP of Software, UK and Ireland at Diebold Nixdorf. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
What are the key software trends and likely developments in the industry in 2018?
So banks are wrestling with a couple of fundamental challenges. On one hand, they're having to think about how they run and maintain the legacy bank. And then on the other hand, they're having to think about how they build the future bank. And that's sort of driving an awful lot of the sort of macro trends that exist in financial services at the moment. So if you think about the legacy environment, there's a lot of focus on how they manage down their cost of operations, a lot of focus about how they continue to comply with regulation, but also how they sort of outsource services as well and leverage third parties where they can either provide additional value or where banks perhaps don't have the scale to drive the sort of efficiencies that they used to be able to do. And then on the future bank side, it's all about sort of investing in new types of technology that will create, much richer, more engaging customer experiences. Now, how that then translates into software strategies, certainly banks, I think across the board, will be leading with a digital first agenda. But that's not just about sort of customer experiences, but it's also about the sort of digital processes that exist within the bank itself. And if you think about it, a lot of banks have been through sort of 2 or 3 generations of digital change internally, and I certainly think that will continue. We also have elements of new regulation coming on that I think will influence software strategies, and PSD2 is a really good example of that, where it's forcing banks to think a little bit differently about their customers, about the competition, but also how they need to engage differently with the sort of fintech industry. And then on top of that, I think we'll still see quite a few pockets of innovation around things like kind of chatbots, voice platforms, artificial intelligence will be used increasingly by banks. But maybe above all of that is how banks start to make better use of data to create sort of connected insights for their customers.
How do you see these trends playing out in the branch environment?
So whilst the sort of branch network in the UK's diminished quite significantly since the financial crisis, bank branches are certainly fundamental to the channel strategies that they still employ. And the branch network is still the only physical interaction point that banks have with their customers. But also if you look at things like conversion rates or transaction values, then they typically tend to be quite a bit higher in the branch network than they are through other channels. I think the challenge that banks have got though is that the branch platforms have grown up in a silo, which has made it very, very difficult for the branches to connect effectively with the broader kind of ecosystem either within the bank or more broadly outside of that. So certainly from a software perspective, we're seeing a lot more investment in new branch formats that are starting to transition the branch from just being very service orientated into more self-service orientated and then into more sales type stores. And then the second big trend is how do banks bring the whole digital experience back into the sort of branch environment as well. And a big part of that is how do they sort of start to break down some of the silos of operation so that you can start a transaction in perhaps one channel but then execute it in the branch. And a very good example of that would be perhaps mobile cash, where you could pre-authorize a transaction on your mobile phone and then execute that transaction in the branch through either NFC or through a QR code. And that is it's a much cheaper form of operation for the bank. It's also more secure, but it's also a much better, richer experience from a consumer perspective as well.
What part does software play in personalising customer experiences, and how can banks enhance the customer journey?
So I think you only need to look at the growth in the fintech sector to really sort of see and understand what impact software has had on financial services, and certainly what software will have kind of moving forward into the future. A lot of that sort of software investment, either from the sort of fintech community or from banks themselves, has been all geared to creating much richer customer experiences and customer journeys. So it's both about simplifying the process, but also, as I say, creating a much more valuable, rich experience that's personalised to the customer. But it's not just about software. you also need to embed data into that whole process to really get to the point of creating truly unique and personalised journeys for individual customers.
The industry is talking more and more about big data and how this can be used to differentiate customer experiences. What are your thoughts on this, and what's the potential for the future?
So data is critical in creating unique and valuable customer engagements. I think the challenge that banks have got, though, is that they've had a wealth of data on their customers for a long time, but they haven't really been able to create actionable insights that they can then use to create those experiences. And when I say actionable insights, it's really all about having data that's accessible real time. It's data that is relevant to the transaction that's happening, that it adds value, and it's also executable by the customer themselves. So I think in a banking context, the whole big data concept they need to be careful about, because that extends that whole sort of data source, exponentially. So I think initially, if they can leverage the data they have and create those, truly insightful, actionable points, at that point they can then perhaps start to look at the sort of broader ecosystem of data and use big data in its truest sense.
Thanks very much, Richard.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching.